Ever since Donald Trump lost the 2020 presidential election, there's been a big push in Republican-controlled states to change the rules around voting and election certification. Case in point, Georgia, which elected 2 Democratic senators last November. Under a new law in that state, there are new ID requirements for absentee ballots. The legislature can effectively take over local election boards. And if you offer food or water to voters waiting in line, you could be charged with a misdemeanor. The Biden Justice Department has gone to court to overturn the Georgia law, but yesterday a federal judge denied a motion to delay the law's implementation ahead of 2 state legislative runoff elections next week. Since the Massachusetts legislature is controlled by Democrats, you might think nothing similar could happen here, but you'd be wrong. This week, the MassGOP launched a new campaign to change voter ID requirements in this state. So anyone voting has to present identification at their polling place. The details of a possible ballot question still haven't been hammered out, but the plan is to put it before voters next fall. Secretary of State Bill Galvin has already weighed in against the idea, telling Boston.com, quote, "Many voters, such as senior citizens who give up their driver's licenses, do not typically carry photo identification." So, how likely is it that voter ID will become a reality here? And what is the best case to be made for the idea and against it? I'm joined now by Tom Mountain, the vice chair of the MassGOP, and by Rahsaan Hall, the director of the Racial Justice Program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Thank you both for being here.
My pleasure.
Tom, let me start with you. As you see it, what is wrong with the way voting works right now in Massachusetts?
Well, the way voting works right now is flawed. We have too many absentee ballots coming in, and those are not being regulated. Those are subject to massive fraud, massive indiscretions, and especially this past year in the presidential and the statewide elections. But nevertheless, what we're aiming for is something very simple, and that is for voter IDs for any citizen who wishes to vote. Now, you need an identification in order to pick up a prescription, to board an airline, to cash a check, to buy alcohol. You need an identification for all the basic necessities in life. That is common sense. Now, but for some reason, we don't have a requirement in the state for the most important civic duty, which is to vote, to show a voter ID. So in other words, anyone can come into my precinct and say that they are me with my address and say that they are me, and they can pull a ballot and vote as me. But however, if they have a photo ID, they can't do that. And that's what we want to prevent in the state. We want to prevent any type of voter fraud.
Let me jump in and ask you, you used the phrase massive fraud when you were making the case for why we should change the way we do business here. Do you have numbers about how many people have voted in a fraudulent way who would not have been able to vote that way if they had IDs?
We don't have specific numbers, and we will admit that our resources are limited in terms of shall we say, coming up with exact numbers. But to us, it's really common sense that if you can just show up and declare yourself to be a certain individual, and there's no way, shape, or form that you need to validate your true identity, then that's the potential for voter fraud.
Rahsaan,
and that can happen.
Rahsaan, let me go to you. You heard Tom identify the various things that we use IDs for. Can't remember if you mentioned driving. Obviously, we're supposed to have a photo ID if we're driving. I know that you haven't seen a specific proposal yet from the MassGOP to respond to, but from your vantage point, what is the argument to be made against requiring a photo ID when people vote? Whether or not there's evidence of massive fraud, as Tom claims, if we use a photo ID for all these other things, why not for voting as well?
Well, first, let me just say very clearly, the ACLU is a nonpartisan organization that is dedicated to defending the rights to individuals to vote, and in the spirit of protecting democracy and racial equity. This is nothing new than old poison in new bottles, another attempt to disenfranchise voters who are historically marginalized. The statistics show that the people who are less likely to have forms of photo identification are people of color, senior citizens, the disabled, younger people, and people who are either non-binary or transgendered. And so to put forward an initiative like this under the auspices of protecting the integrity of the vote when there is a zero evidence of voter fraud is ludicrous. They've come up with a solution to a problem that does not exist. When the Secretary of the Commonwealth says in this last election and elections before that they haven't seen a problem with voter fraud, when any of the 11 district attorneys or the attorney generals, who are the people who would be responsible for prosecuting voter fraud cases, have no cases that they've prosecuted, or few, if any, cases to Mr. Mountain's concern of resources of voter fraud, that suggests that this problem does not exist. People have a greater likelihood of being struck by lightning than they have of someone showing up to a polling location and impersonating them to steal their vote. And what a ridiculous and laborious way to try to steal an election, by going from polling location to polling location to say that you're somebody that you're not.
Tom, let me get you to respond to the two criticisms that Rahsaan just raised. To paraphrase you, Rahsaan, tell me if I get this wrong, no evidence that voter fraud is actually happening, and voter ID requirement would disenfranchise the specific groups that he mentioned. What's your response to those concerns?
Well, just in terms of disenfranchising groups, actually, we want to do the opposite. We want to enfranchise everyone as much as possible. And in order to do that, we need people to be certified that they are who they are when they go in to vote. Now, those people that you mentioned before, yes, the elderly and disabled and minorities. Now, surely they must at some point have to pick up prescription medicine. They must at some point have to cash checks in which they need an identification. So what we're saying is that if you have to have an ID for those personal things, then why not have an ID for voting? You have to when you get on a plane, you need to show an ID. When you show up when you drive a car, you need an ID. You need an ID.
But you don't have a right
everything.
to do those things. Voting is a right. It is a fundamental
right.
And so we shouldn't put an ID requirement on top of a fundamental right.
Voting is a fundamental right. That's why we want to maintain the integrity of it. We want.
And there's no evidence that the integrity has been compromised.
Yeah, let me ask you, just to address that point, Tom, if you can. I know that you and I talked a little about this a moment ago, but what do you say to Rahsaan saying this is a solution to a problem that simply doesn't exist based on the evidence we have?
Well, for example, again, I will get back to the analogy of those who go into a bank and don't have an ID. How do we know that they are the person who are cashing a check? And that will something like that prohibits or protects bank fraud, and we certainly want to protect voter fraud. While we can't cite statistics, again, because we don't have the resources to do it, what we're addressing is from a perspective of common sense. Why is it so difficult for people to show an identification when they go in to vote? 36 states already have identification requirements. Some of those states do not have photo ID, but we, in fact, in our state want to have a photo ID requirement.
Let me ask you.
And this will eliminate fraud, any potential fraud that should come our way.
Let me ask you about the specifics of this proposal. As I understand it, it's still fluid. You guys are still trying to figure out what you want to get on the ballot. If I recall correctly, you told Boston.com that you envisioned what you termed a non-strict law, where if this were to pass, you'd be able to go to a polling place, and if you didn't have an ID, you could vote anyway, as long as you sign an affidavit saying that you were who you said that you are. That could be followed up on. And you also, sorry to interrupt, I just want to make sure, you talked about getting people IDs for free, correct? No charge?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Is that
yes, that would be from either the state or the municipal agency or the city or town in which you live would give you an ID, which you should have anyway. I mean, think of it. If you're in an accident or you fall flat on your face on the sidewalk, you don't have an ID. How in the world are people going to know who you are? But to the point of voting, you need an ID in order to vote, to get in the voting booth. And specific, if you don't have an ID, yes, under the rarest of circumstances, we would have people sign an affidavit at the voting booth under penalties of perjury. In other words, if you're lying, you're going to get in a lot of trouble and probably hopefully end up in jail. But that is a rare exception.
Yeah, that's currently the state of the law in Massachusetts, where except there's not a requirement for photo identification, but we do have an identification requirement in Massachusetts where people are required to show a phone bill or a utility bill or a bank statement to their address where they are registered to vote. And if they don't have the forms of identification or need to re-register at the polling location, they sign an affidavit of current and continuous residence. So, let's not create solutions to problems that don't exist.
Rahsaan, let me ask you about that, because in my experience, I have been able to walk into a polling place and say, I'm Adam Reilly from this particular address. They find you, and in I go without having, for example, a phone bill or something like that. Is it not supposed to work that way?
It is supposed to work that way. People are supposed to be able to go into their polling location and cast a ballot. And in an instance where somebody's name is on the inactive list,
gotcha,
or they need to file a provisional ballot, those are some of the steps that can be taken where there is a request to sign this type of affidavit.
I'm glad that I didn't just rat out overly generous poll workers in my hometown. So, sorry, Tom, back to you. Other way.
No, that's more or less relying on the honor system, and we're not going to do that. Bringing in a utility bill or something of the sort, that's all well and good, but there could be several people in the household, and bringing in a utility bill from a particular address is frankly not good enough. We need exact validation that the person who says that they are the person voting is the person who is voting, which is why we need a valid, preferably government-issued ID. Now, in the rare circumstances, for example, the college kids coming in for the first time, we would accept that, or an employee ID. But still, the ideal one is to have a government-issued ID, which as a Republican, as you know, I'm not a fan of government issuing anything. But in this particular case, we would make the exception and stress a government picture ID for the person who is voting on that particular election.
I should mention, many of our viewers will be aware of this already, but this discussion is unfolding at a time when the legislature is considering making permanent some of the COVID-related changes that we saw last year. Universal mail-in voting, expanded early voting. Rahsaan, has the ACLU taken a position on whether it is the right way to go to make those provisions permanent?
Yes, we are a big proponent of the Votes Act that is pending before the legislature that would make permanent those changes, because we all know that democracy works better when everyone who is eligible to participate in it can participate in it. And it appears that certain parties want to exclude people because that increases the likelihood of their victory. And so there's ample evidence that suggests that the more people are engaged, the better outcomes you get. The broader the expansion is made for voting access, you get more people of color, more historically marginalized groups, poor people, people who have recently moved, younger people, seniors, disabled. It's better that we have more people involved in our democracy if you want to take it seriously. And putting these restrictions in place only serves to minimize the number of people who would like to participate in our democracy.
Tom, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the MassGOP is not keen on seeing those changes made permanent, correct?
We don't want any of those changes implemented. That would entail massive mail-in voting. We don't want any of them. What we want to have happen is what has been happening since 1780 when John Adams wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, and that included to have in-person voting on the day that you're supposed to vote, which is usually the first Tuesday in November. You show up at the polls and you vote at the polls, but we want it to be done with an ID, no mail-in voting, except on those rare circumstances where you need an absentee ballot where you're either serving or overseas or in the military. We want it to be the way it's been for over 2 centuries, almost
Gotcha.
2.5 centuries in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, as a black man in Massachusetts, I'm not looking to go back 200 centuries. It's interesting because the poll that supports this initiative that more Americans are in support of voter ID, that same poll says more Americans are in favor of making it easier to vote in person early. But I don't see an initiative coming from this group for that voting reform either. So it speaks volumes about what the true intentions are here.
Tom, let me ask you just a closing question. This will be where we have to wrap up. But I think we have an image of the pitch from the MassGOP for this voter ID initiative. Secure our elections, save America, demand voter ID. As you see it, and your colleagues at the MassGOP, who would this Save America Or what would this save America from?
It would ensure voter integrity. It would save our democracy in terms of one person, one vote. There would be no debate, or rather argument, that there was any type of fraudulent voting, voter indiscretions, and it would put the matter to rest that there was, is, or could be fraud in current or future elections, because everyone would have an ID. And
Gotcha.
Since everyone would have an ID, we could validate that they are the person they say they are when they go in to vote.
Okay, Tom Mountain, Rahsaan Hall, we have to leave it there. Thank you both for making time to talk about this.
Thank you.